There is a sound that used to define an American garage. Not music, not a television. The sound of a tool doing exactly what it was built to do. A wrench finding its grip. A blade catching clean. A flashlight clicking on in the dark and holding steady. For most of the 20th century, the tools that made those sounds were built by Americans, in American factories, by workers who came back to the same building every morning for 20, 30, 40 years. 5 of those brands lasted over a century. Leatherman, Channellock, Buck Knives, Maglite, Estwing. 5 different companies. 5 different products. 5 different stories of what it took to build something that people trusted with their hands, their work, and their lives. But each of them arrived at the same moment, a single decision, a single year, a single force that tested everything they had built. Some of those decisions came from inside a boardroom. Some came from a $5 light bulb. Some came from a law passed 3,000 miles away from the factory floor. If you grew up with any of these tools in your garage, if you remember the weight of them, the feel of them, the way they never seemed to break, this is the story of how those tools came to exist, what it cost to keep them alive, and what almost ended them. This is 100 years of American craftsmanship. 5 brands. 5 moments when everything could have gone the other way. Let's start at the beginning. In 1983, Gerber passed on it. AT&T passed on it. The United States Army passed on it. Every knife company Tim Leatherman approached said it was a tool, not a knife. Every tool company said it was a gadget, not a tool. For 8 years, nobody in America with the resources to manufacture what he had built was willing to do it. He got hundreds of letters back. Most of them said no in a single paragraph. One company could not even spell his partner's name correctly on the rejection. Today, 128 million of those tools have been sold in more than 80 countries. The Museum of Modern Art in New York put one in their permanent collection. NASA flies them to the International Space Station. United States soldiers carry them into combat. And if you have ever worked with your hands, in a garage, on a job site, out in the field, somewhere when something broke and you needed to fix it, there is a reasonable chance one is sitting in your pocket right now. The most rejected invention in American tool history became the most copied multi-tool on Earth. This is not a quick story. It is a story about a borrowed garage and a stack of unanswered letters, and a wife who believed in something her husband could not stop building, even when the rest of the world had already decided it was not worth their time. Chapter 1. The Fiat 600. In the summer of 1975, Tim Leatherman was 26 years old, newly married, and running low on money in Amsterdam. He had graduated from Oregon State University 5 years earlier with a degree in mechanical engineering. He had met his wife, Chow, a Vietnamese woman, in the basement of a Portland State dormitory over a game of ping pong. They had married in Saigon in 1972, months before that city's world collapsed around them. Now they were newlyweds trying to see 17 countries on a budget so tight that their entire transportation plan involved a used car purchased in the Netherlands for $300. The car was a 1968 Fiat 600. It was cheap for a reason. Over the next 10 months, traveling through France, Italy, and deep into the Middle East, that Fiat broke down more times than Tim could count. Every time it stopped, every time a hose cracked or a fitting came loose, or something rattled free somewhere in the engine, Tim crouched beside the car with what he had in his pocket. A Boy Scout-style folding knife. It cut bread. It pried open things that were not meant to be pried open. It was better than nothing. But what Tim kept wishing for, on a road outside Tehran, with the engine cooling in the dust, was a pair of pliers. Just a pair of pliers, small enough to carry in your pocket, strong enough to actually fix something when the moment required it. He pulled a piece of paper from his shirt pocket and started sketching. The rough outline of what would become the Leatherman multi-tool took shape for the first time on that road, drawn by a man standing next to a broken-down Fiat because he had nothing better to do while he waited. He did not know yet what those sketches were going to cost him. Chapter 2: The Garage. When Tim and Chow came home to Portland, they made a quiet arrangement between them. She would work. She spent those years supporting Vietnamese refugees through resettlement programs, keeping food on the table, keeping the household running, while Tim built something in his brother-in-law's borrowed garage that she believed in even when she could not have fully explained to anyone outside that garage why she did. Tim told her the prototype would take about a month. It took 3 years. He salvaged metal from discarded appliances. He taught himself the tolerances the design required, the hinge tension, the blade retention, the bite angle of the pliers, the way a file surface has to be cut to actually remove material and not just drag across it. He built the whole tool around one idea: folding pliers at the center. Everything else, the knife, the file, the screwdrivers, the awl, the can opener, the wire cutters, living in the handles that the pliers folded back into. 13 functions. 4 inches closed. Stainless steel throughout. He filed for the patent on July 13th, 1978. It was granted on December 16th, 1980. United States Patent Number 4238862, Pocket Multiple Tool. By 1980, Tim had something real, a working prototype, a legal patent, a name for what he had built. He called the early concept Mr. Crunch. The name would not survive, but the object would. Now he needed someone to manufacture it. Chapter 3: The Wall of Rejection. What happened next lasted 3.5 years. Tim Leatherman wrote letters. He made phone calls. He showed up at trade shows. He brought his prototype to knife companies and tool companies and corporate purchasing departments and government agencies. He went to AT&T, arguing that telephone technicians carried tools every day and needed exactly this kind of thing on their belt. AT&T was not interested. He went to the United States Army. The Army was not interested. He walked into Gerber, one of the most respected knife companies in America, headquartered in Portland, within driving distance of the garage where he had spent 3 years building the thing. Gerber passed. The knife companies said it was a tool, not a knife. The tool companies said it was a gadget, not a tool. One rejection letter came back with Steve Berliner's name spelled wrong. The company could not be bothered to spell the name right on the piece of paper that said no. Stand in that place for a moment if you can. You have spent 3 years in a garage building something from scrap metal and borrowed machinery. You have a patent. You have a working tool in your hand that you believe in completely. And for 3.5 years, every company you bring it to looks at it, handles it, sets it back down on the table, and tells you the same thing. No market, no category, no interest. Not because the tool is bad, because the market does not exist yet. Because there is no shelf at any retailer where a folding plier-based pocket tool belongs. Because the buyers you need to say yes have spent their entire careers selling things that fit known categories, and this does not fit any of them. When something does not exist yet, it is nearly impossible to sell the idea of making it. This is where most people stop. This is where the idea ends, and the person walks back into a normal life and maybe tells the story at dinner parties for the rest of their days about the thing they almost built. Tim Leatherman did not stop. Chow did not tell him to. That combination, a man who could not quit and a woman who never asked him to, is the reason 128 million of these tools exist today. Chapter 4: Steve Berliner and the 7th Year. There is a moment in most long struggles where something shifts. Not the final breakthrough, just the thing that makes the breakthrough possible. For Tim Leatherman, that moment arrived in roughly his 7th year in the form of an old college friend named Steve Berliner. Berliner had known Tim since Oregon State. His father owned a metalworking business in Portland called Simplicity Tool Company. Berliner was practical where Tim was relentless. He looked at the prototype and saw something worth betting on. But he also saw a problem. Tim had been approaching manufacturers with a wholesale price of $40 per unit, too high for the market he was targeting. Berliner told him to cut it, to drop it to $20, simplify the pitch. Stop approaching knife companies and tool companies, and start approaching outdoor catalogs, the people who sold to hunters and campers and tradespeople who wanted to be ready without buying a full toolbox. Tim listened. On July 5, 1983, Leatherman Tool Group Incorporated was born in Portland, Oregon. Berliner would help manage the business. Simplicity tool machines would handle early production on a subcontract basis. Tim would build the tool and put his name on every single one. That last part was not a marketing decision. It was personal. Tim said it as plainly as it can be said. It has to be perfect. My name is on every tool. Chapter 5, Christmas 1983. At the 1983 SHOT Show, the annual outdoor and sporting goods trade gathering, Tim stood at a small booth and put his tool into the hands of every buyer who walked past. Cabela's, the Nebraska Outdoor Catalog Company, placed the first order, 500 units, with 7 months to deliver. Early Winters, a Seattle gear catalog, placed a concurrent order for their holiday issue. The first pocket survival tools shipped just before Christmas, 1983. In the first week of January, 1984, Early Winters doubled their order. A week later, they ordered again. Then, 1,000 more, 2 weeks after that. Tim's goal for all of 1984 had been 4,000 tools. By the end of that year, Leatherman had shipped nearly 30,000. 30,000 in the first year of existence, for a product that every company in America had already decided had no market. Chapter 6, The Numbers That Built a Name. By 1993, Leatherman was selling more than 1 million tools per year. Revenue had crossed $30 million. The catalog market Berliner had identified had opened into hardware stores, then sporting goods retailers, then military exchanges, then every major outdoor retailer in America. In 1994 came the Super Tool, the first Leatherman with fully locking blades. 650,000 units in its second year alone. In 1996, an engineer at Leatherman named Ben Rivera, who had joined the company 5 years earlier fresh out of school, designed the Micra, a compact scissors-based tool the size of a large key fob. It sold out within weeks of launch. 2 years later, Rivera spent 2 years redesigning the flagship from the ground up. The result was the Wave, introduced at the 1998 SHOT Show. It was the first Leatherman with blades accessible from the outside, opening one-handed. It became the best-selling multi-tool in history. In 2001, cumulative sales crossed 20 million. Revenue crossed $100 million. In 2004, the Museum of Modern Art in New York inducted the Wave into their permanent design collection, a folding plier-based tool from a factory in Portland, Oregon, sitting alongside the design objects of the 20th century. That is where the company stood. $40 million in year 2 of the company's existence had become $100 million annually. One man in a garage with a patent and a stack of rejection letters had become the largest multi-tool manufacturer on Earth. Chapter 7. What the rejection letters could not see. The companies that passed were not foolish. They were making rational decisions with the information they had. When a purchasing manager held Tim's prototype in 1980, they were not evaluating whether the tool was good. They were evaluating whether they could sell it. And to answer that question, they looked at what customers had bought before, what shelf space existed, what category the tool would be listed under. None of that pointed toward yes, because no comparable product had ever been sold. Nobody had filled out a survey saying they wished they had pliers in their pocket. The demand did not show up in any report because the product did not yet exist. What the spreadsheets could not measure was the gap between what people said they needed and what they actually reached for when something broke. Every person who had ever tried to fix a car on the side of a road with a tool that was not meant for the job. Every technician who had ever wished for a different tool than the one in their hand. Every soldier, every farmer, every contractor standing in a situation where having the right thing would have made the difference. That demand was real, and it was everywhere. It was just invisible to anyone looking at a sales report, because it had never been satisfied before. The companies did not pass on a bad idea. They passed on the best-selling multi-tool in human history because they were not built to see what was not yet there. Tim Leatherman was built exactly that way. Chapter 8, Portland. While everyone else left. If you are old enough to remember when craftsmen meant something, you already know this part of the story. Not intellectually. You know it the way you know things that happened to you rather than things you read about. You know what it felt like when the tools got lighter in your hand, and not in a good way. When the warranty that used to mean something started meaning less. When the box said the same name it always had, and the tool inside was not quite the same tool it used to be. That is what happened to most of the American tool brands that people in this country had trusted for generations. The ones that stayed domestic for as long as they could, and then made the calculation that they could not anymore. The ones that moved production overseas, quietly at first, and then without apology, because the cost differential between a factory in Ohio and a factory in southern China had grown too large to absorb and still compete on retail price. That calculation was not irrational. It was the same one that gutted American manufacturing across 30 years of offshoring. The numbers genuinely did not work. Leatherman did the same math, and then stayed in Portland anyway. Tim Leatherman was asked more than once over the years whether the company had ever seriously considered moving production overseas. His answer was the same every time. No, never any consideration. We are proud of the jobs we have created here in Portland. That is not a tagline. That is 40 years of payroll decisions, renewed every quarter, every time a consultant ran the numbers, and the numbers came back the same. That is more than 500 people who showed up to a factory 2 miles east of Portland International Airport because Leatherman Tool Group decided once that they were staying and then never revisited the decision. The 25-year warranty printed inside every Leatherman tool is the consequence of that decision. You cannot promise to fix something for 25 years if you are not certain you will still be there in 25 years. You cannot honor a lifetime commitment from a building you no longer own in a city where you no longer operate. Leatherman stayed. The warranty means something because the people are still there. Most of the brands your father trusted are not still there. Their names survive. The soul of what they were does not always survive with the name. Leatherman is one of the FU that never made you find that out. Chapter 9. The Factory Floor. The factory sits at 12,106 Northeast Ainsworth Circle in Portland. And if you go on a Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, they will let you walk through it for free. You hear it before you see the production floor. Coils weighing 800 pounds of American steel, sourced from mills in Ohio, feed into 300-ton hydraulic presses. The sound is not background noise. It lands in your chest before it reaches your ears. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not the chaos of a plant running at maximum throughput, but the rhythm of something being made carefully, at the pace that careful making demands. Components move from the presses to grinding stations where file teeth are cut into steel at tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Blades travel to a heat treating partner 12 miles south in Milwaukee, Oregon, hardened and tempered, then returned for final finishing. The smell of cutting fluid and fine steel dust settles into everything by midday. Into the air, into your clothes, into your hands if you stay long enough. And then the tools are assembled by hand. Leatherman tested automation on the assembly floor. They ran the trials, analyzed the results, did the engineering analysis. The robots could not do it. The precise hinge tension that makes a Leatherman feel right when you open it, tight enough to hold position, smooth enough to work with one hand, has to be set by a person who has tensioned 10,000 hinges and knows before the tool fully closes whether it is right or whether it needs another half turn. You cannot download that. You cannot optimize it away and still have the same tool on the other side of the process. More than 500 people work in Portland today, not in a corporate headquarters. On the factory floor, on the quality control line, in the repair department where tools come back under the warranty, get fixed, and go home again. The steel is American. The assembly is by hand. Each tool carries a date code stamped inside the handle, so the warranty department knows exactly when it was built. That date code is a promise. The people still in Portland are the ones who intend to keep it. Chapter 10, 40 years on, still building. Tim Leatherman is in his mid-70s now. He still comes to the factory. He gives tours on Wednesday mornings to anyone who shows up. There is no charge. You just walk in. In January 2026, Ben Rivera, the engineer who designed the Micra and the Wave, and who spent 34 years at the same company, handed the chief executive role to Chris Hamper, Leatherman's longtime chief financial officer, and moved into an advisory role focused on product development. Rivera said publicly he believes the best Leatherman product has not been built yet. In July 2025, Leatherman launched its first dedicated knife line, 5 precision-crafted fixed blades built from premium MagnaCut steel, manufactured at a new Portland facility built specifically for the knife line. In October 2025, Leatherman introduced the Wave Alpha, a premium redesign of the most important multi-tool ever made. In November 2025, Leatherman launched a peer-to-peer resale marketplace called Leatherman Exchange, where the full 25-year warranty transfers to the second owner. Not a modified version, the same warranty. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment. It is a company saying their product will outlive the person who buys it the first time, and backing that claim with a warranty that follows the tool, not the original buyer. In an era when most consumer goods are designed to be replaced within 2 years, that is not a small thing to promise. And it is not marketing language. It is warranty policy backed by 4 decades of the same people in the same building, making the same tool the same way. Closing. Portland. Close your eyes. Stand outside 12,106 Northeast Ainsworth Circle in Portland, Oregon. Close your eyes. Hear the 300-ton presses cycling. Feel the low vibration moving up through the concrete and into your feet. Think about Chow Leatherman working across town while Tim measured hinge tolerances in a borrowed garage with scrap metal from someone else's discarded appliances. Think about the stack of rejection letters on the workbench. Gerber, AT&T, the United States Army. The company that could not spell the name right on the piece of paper that said no. 8 years of that. 8 years of the same answer from every company that had the resources to say yes. Open your eyes. More than 500 people are at work today. They did not lose the factory. They did not sell the name. They did not move the work to where the labor was cheaper and the quarterly earnings were easier to defend. The presses are still running. The steel is American. The tool is still assembled by hand by people who know what right feels like because they have done it 10,000 times. And the name on every one of them is the same name it has carried since 1983. The name of a man who heard no from everyone who mattered for 8 years and built 128 million yesies anyway. If you carry one of these, you already know what that name means. That is what refusing to stop looks like when the only person who believes in you is yourself. But Tim Leatherman's fight was against rejection, against the market, against the industry's imagination. The next company on this list fought a different battle entirely. They did not need to convince the world their product was good. The world already knew. Their fight was against the people who wanted to buy them, the ones who wanted to take what they had built, strip it down, and move it somewhere cheaper. They said no in a decade when almost no one else did. This is Channellock. In 2008, a factory in DeWitt, Nebraska closed its doors forever. 330 workers showed up one last time, turned off their machines, and walked out. The pliers they had been making in that building since 1924, 86 years of American manufacturing, were now going to be made in China. The town of DeWitt had fewer than 500 people. It lost 330 jobs in a single announcement. That factory made Vise-Grip. You know Vise-Grip. Every garage in America had at least one pair. It was the locking plier that farmers used to hold broken equipment together long enough to get through harvest. The tool that mechanics reached for when nothing else worked. It was invented by a blacksmith named William Peterson in a small Nebraska town, and it survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. Then, a corporation named Newell Rubbermaid bought it, looked at the numbers, and sent it to China. 800 miles east, in Meadville, Pennsylvania, a different factory was watching this happen, and it decided it would never let that be its story. Today, that Meadville factory is still running. It still employs 325 people. It still drop forges every pair of pliers from American steel in the same town where it has operated for over 100 years. In 2026, it is celebrating its 140th anniversary. Its name is Channellock. And the reason it survived everything that destroyed the rest of American hand tool manufacturing comes down to one structural fact that has nothing to do with technology, marketing, or luck. It comes down to who owns it and what they owe. If you have spent any time in a garage, on a job site, or next to someone who worked with their hands for a living, this story is going to mean something to you. The story begins in 1886 in a small Pennsylvania town called Evansburg, which today is known as Conneaut Lake. A 33-year blacksmith named George B. DeArmont had a problem. Farriers, the men who shod horses, had limited choices when it came to their tools. What existed was overpriced, undersized, or poorly forged. DeArmont was not satisfied with any of it. He spent his winters in a shop, hand-forging hoof parers and nippers from scratch, and every spring he loaded everything onto a horse and wagon and drove from town to town along the railroad lines of western Pennsylvania, selling his inventory until it was gone. When the wagon was empty, he sold the wagon and rode the train home. Then he started again. That loop of forging, selling, riding home, then forging again was the entire business model of what he called the Champion Bolt and Clipper Company for its first several years. There was no outside investor who needed the numbers to look good by the end of a fiscal quarter. There was a man, a forge, and the belief that if you made something well enough, people would pay for it. By 1891, the company had grown enough to rename itself the Champion Tool Company. In 1902, Champion received an order for farriers' tools from the royal household of King Edward VII of England. For a small Pennsylvania workshop, it was a signal that quality traveled further than geography. George DeArmond kept the original letter framed in the factory for the rest of his life, a blacksmith from rural Pennsylvania, selling to the King of England. But the real tests were still coming. In 1893, a local bank teller embezzled the company's entire cash reserves. Everything DeArmond had built over 7 years was gone in a single act of theft. He could have walked away. He was in his 40s, with a company that had just been hollowed out from the inside. Instead, he raised capital, rebuilt, and was operational again by 1894. The company's first near-death experience came not from the market or competition, but from inside. DeArmond absorbed it and kept moving. In 1904, the company relocated to Meadville, Pennsylvania, moving into a 12,000 square foot building in a town that understood what it meant to make things with your hands. By 1911, George's sons Almond and Howard had joined as partners. By 1923, the company moved to its current address on South Main Street. By 1927, after Howard's death, Almond renamed the business Champion DeArmond Tool Company. The company has not left South Main Street since. Then came a slower, more permanent crisis. By the early 1930s, the automobile had replaced the horse across America. The entire farrier market, the reason the company existed, was collapsing. A business built around tools for horses had a clear choice: find a new product or disappear alongside the economy that created it. In 1933, a chief engineer named Howard Manning gave them the answer. Before 1933, pliers were pliers. You had your size, your fixed pivot, your limited range of motion. The slip joint plier existed, but its mechanism was weak. The pivot pin had to carry the full shear load of everything you were gripping. Use it hard enough, long enough, and the joint would loosen. For a plumber tightening a fitting or a mechanic reaching into an engine bay, a plier that slipped was worse than useless. Manning redesigned the joint from the ground up. Instead of relying on the pin to carry the force, his design transferred the shear load to a curved ridge and groove system of much greater radius. Multiple jaw positions became possible without weakening the joint. The grip stayed firm regardless of how much torque the user applied. The jaw adjusted to the work instead of making the worker adjust to the tool. United States Patent number 1,950,362 was granted in 1934. It was one of the most consequential hand tool patents of the 20th century. And almost nobody outside the skilled trades knows Howard Manning's name today. The tongue and groove plier did something that hand tools rarely do. It became generic. Plumbers called it a Channellock, whether it came from Meadville or not. Mechanics called it a Channellock. Electricians called it a channel lock. The word became a product category, the way Xerox became copying and Band-Aid became a bandage. When that happens, you protect it or you lose it. In 1963, the DeArmond family renamed the entire corporation Channellock Incorporated, not for a rebrand, to protect what Manning had invented 30 years earlier. If the word was going to live in the American vocabulary, it was going to live with a trademark attached to it. By the late 1950s, Channellock was dipping the handles of its pliers in liquefied blue polyvinyl chloride, a specific blue, Pantone 299C, the blue that every plumber, electrician, and pipe fitter learned to recognize on site. Workers could reach into a crowded tool bag in the dark and know by color and weight that they had the right plier in their hand. In 1988, Channellock registered that color as a United States trademark. Registration number 1,536,106. It was one of the very first color-only trademarks ever granted in this country, a legally controversial idea, because no one had successfully argued that a color alone could constitute a brand. In 1992, Cooper Industries, a major industrial conglomerate, filed suit to invalidate the registration. Their argument was that a color could not be a trademark. Channellock pushed for a jury trial. Cooper withdrew. Today, Channellock Blue is actively defended on every continent where the company operates. The color is not just a branding decision. It is a legal boundary drawn around a standard that took a century to build. Stand on the forge floor at the Meadville plant, and your first response is physical. The heat hits you before you see anything. The air smells like hot steel and cutting oil, and the particular mineral sharpness of metal under pressure. The sound is not a sound you process, it is a pressure you feel in your chest. The drop forge hammer comes down on a glowing billet of 1080 high carbon steel, and the floor shudders. A pair of Channellock pliers begins as a steel rod, cut to length, heated in a gas furnace until it glows a deep orange, then struck between dies that weigh more than most cars. The two halves of the plier form simultaneously. They come out of the dies as rough forgings, trimmed, then body hardened, then laser heat treated on the working surfaces, the teeth and the cutting edges, to a hardness that will outlast the handle and probably the hand that holds it. After grinding and polishing, the finished metal is dipped into liquefied PVC plastisol and pulled out slowly. The blue handle forms around the steel on contact. Not sprayed on, not bonded with adhesive. Grown around the tool, the way bark grows around a tree. Every cutting blade is tested by hand, slicing fibrous twine. If a single strand survives the cut, the blade goes back to the grinder. No exceptions. 350 people come to this building every day to do this work. The same work, in the same town, year after year. The threat that almost ended all of it did not arrive overnight. It accumulated over decades, the way rust does. Starting in the 1980s, Asian manufacturers, primarily in China and Taiwan, began producing pliers at a fraction of the American cost. By the 1990s, the cost differential was not marginal. It was structural. An American plier manufacturer paying union wages in Pennsylvania, sourcing steel domestically, carrying a lifetime warranty, and operating inside American labor and environmental law, was competing against factories with labor costs 10 to 15 times lower. No warranty obligation, and no structural impediment to cutting whatever corners the market would not notice. Most American hand tool manufacturers could not survive that math. They did not go bankrupt exactly. They were acquired. The brands were kept, the factories were closed, the production moved, the name stayed, the soul left. You have seen this story with Craftsman, with Stanley, with dozens of brands whose names still exist on store shelves, but whose connection to American manufacturing ended the moment someone looked at a spreadsheet and decided the gap was too wide to justify. Nothing in this era made that story clearer or more specific than what happened in DeWitt, Nebraska, in October 2008. William Peterson was a blacksmith in DeWitt. In 1924, he invented a locking plier, a tool that could grip and hold in position, the way a third hand would. Farmers used it to repair equipment in the field. Mechanics used it to hold what a wrench could not reach. The Vise-Grip became one of the most recognized tools in American history. For decades, Peterson Manufacturing made them in DeWitt. The town of fewer than 500 people built its identity around that factory. In the 1980s, Peterson sold the company to American Tool. In 2002, American Tool was acquired by Newell Rubbermaid, a consumer goods conglomerate based in Atlanta, Georgia, whose portfolio included Rubbermaid containers, Sharpie markers, and Coleman camping equipment. American Tool became Irwin Industrial Tool. Irwin became a product line. Vise-Grip became a stock-keeping unit. In 2008, Newell Rubbermaid announced the DeWitt plant was closing. 330 jobs, 86 years of American manufacturing. The stated reason was keeping the Vise-Grip name competitive. It is worth saying clearly, the executives who made that call were not making an irrational decision. They were making the rational decision available to them, given the structure they were operating inside. A publicly traded company has an obligation to its shareholders. When labor costs in your domestic facility are 15 times what they would be offshore, and when the quality gap has narrowed to the point where most customers cannot distinguish the product, the case for maintaining American production is difficult to make at a board level. Every year you delay the move, you are choosing a cost that your competitors are not bearing. From Atlanta, the spreadsheet gave one answer. What it could not calculate was what 330 jobs meant to a town of 500 people. It could not measure the average tenure of a DeWitt worker, or the pension expectations built over 20 and 30 years, or the fact that there was no comparable employer within 40 miles. It could not calculate the cost of a community that had organized its entire identity around one building, now asked to absorb the decision of a board of directors and simply move on. In October 2008, workers at the DeWitt plant clocked out for the last time. Some had worked there for 2 decades. Some had fathers who worked there. They had made a product that was in virtually every garage in the United States, and that product had become worth less than the cost of making it in the town where it was invented. There is a particular grief that comes with that kind of ending. It is not just the loss of a job. It is the loss of a proposition that good work done consistently over decades in an American town should be worth something. That the thing you made with your hands in a building you drove to every morning had a value that could not be reduced to a line on a cost comparison. The pliers moved to China. The building stood empty. The town that had built Vise-Grip was left to figure out what came next. In Meadville, Pennsylvania, the workers at the Channellock plant were watching. United Steelworkers, Local 1917, represents approximately 300 of the company's employees. The 3-year contracts have been renewed consistently. The last strike was in the late 1980s. The relationship between the de-armament family and the union is not without friction. There have been strike threats, difficult contract years, gaps between what the company could offer and what the workers needed. But the factory has never closed. The jobs have never moved. The workers are still there. John de-Armament, who served as president and COO from 2014 to 2025, has explained the company's position with a directness that cuts through the usual corporate language. Being a family-run business, he said, allows the company to make decisions based on what is best for its workers and community, rather than its shareholders and investors. The company is not pressured to cut corners in order to save money in the short term. Every decision is based on the long-term continued success of the company. That is not a platitude. That is a description of a decision-making structure that produces different outcomes than what happens at a company answerable to outside capital. A family-owned company without outside shareholders does not optimize for the next quarter. It optimizes for the next generation. The time horizon is measured in decades, not earnings cycles. The consequences of a bad long-term decision fall on the family itself, not on fund managers who can exit a position before the damage shows up on a stock price. When Channellock faced the same pressure that Newell Rubbermaid did, the same cost gap, the same competition from Asian manufacturers, and the same forces closing American factories across the country, the family made its calculations differently. Not because they were more virtuous, because the calculation itself was different. In 2012, Channellock's supplier in Taiwan for the thermoplastic grips on their premium code blue pliers went bankrupt. The easy decision was to find another Asian supplier. Instead, the family found a Meadville-based company, Evolution Molding Solutions, and partnered with a Pennsylvania color firm called Retech to match the specific Channellock blue compound precisely to Pantone 299C. The entire code blue grip supply chain was rebuilt inside the same county where the pliers are forged. Lead times shortened by weeks. Freight costs disappeared. The code blue plier, already assembled in Meadville from American steel, became end-to-end American-made in a way it had not been before. This is what reshoring looks like when it is not a press release. It is a problem, a phone call to someone down the road, an engineering solution, and a decision to accept a slightly higher unit cost in exchange for a shorter, more controllable supply chain. Not because it was cheaper, it was not. Because the family decided the supply chain was worth controlling. Because they were not answering to a board in Atlanta. This company has survived moments that should have ended it. In 1893, a bank teller stole the company's cash reserves. George DeArmond rebuilt within a year. In the 1920s, the collapse of the entire farrier market forced the pivot that produced Howard Manning's invention. In March 2020, Pennsylvania's emergency orders required Channellock to furlough all 358 workers. The factory closed on the 19th. Within 5 days, the company obtained a state waiver as a critical manufacturer and reopened. The disruption was measured in days. The workforce returned. Production resumed. And in 2025, American trade policy shifted in ways that materially changed the competitive picture. Tariffs on Chinese goods reached levels that began to close the cost gap between American-made tools and Asian imports. The closure of the de minimis loophole, which had allowed cheap imported goods to enter the United States duty-free, in small direct-to-consumer shipments, removed a mechanism that had quietly benefited foreign manufacturers for years. John DeArmond appeared at a White House roundtable in 2017 on the subject of certified made in USA labeling. He has publicly criticized competitors who claim American-made status while using imported components. For Channellock, trade enforcement is not abstract policy. It is the margin between competing and not competing. In November 2023, Channellock promoted Will DeArmond to product manager. Will is the 6th generation of the DeArmond family to work inside the company. 6 generations. 137 years, from a horse-drawn wagon loaded with hand-forged tools in 1886 to a 6th-generation family member managing product development in the same town. That same year, Channellock launched more than 80 new products, the largest single product introduction in company history. Among them was the first professional locking pliers ever made by Channellock, a direct entry into the segment that Vise-Grip once owned and abandoned when the factory in DeWitt closed. Channellock moved into that space 15 years after the DeWitt closure, with a tool made in Pennsylvania. In February 2025, the company announced a leadership restructuring. John DeArmond moved from president to EVP of manufacturing and engineering. Jimmy Bromley, the company's longtime CFO and the first non-DeArmond to hold the presidency in the modern era, became president. Bill DeArmond remained chairman and CEO. Ryan DeArmond moved to EVP of sales and marketing. The family is not leaving. They are preparing the company for the next generation, the same way they always have. What we lose when factories close is not abstract. It is exactly as specific as 330 names on a notice board. Vise-Grip was not killed by Chinese competition. It was not killed by the price of steel. It was killed by a structure that required short-term returns from long-term assets. A structure that turned the factory in DeWitt into a cost problem instead of a community anchor. Channellock survived because its structure never changed. The family owns it. The family runs it. The factory stays in Meadville. The pliers are still blue. The story of Channellock is not a story about superior technology. The tongue and groove plier that Howard Manning designed in 1933 is not dramatically different from the one being made today. The steel is better. The forging is more precise. The heat treatment is laser-controlled rather than coal-fired. But the fundamental mechanism is unchanged. It is not a story about better marketing. Channellock does not have the advertising budget of Stanley Black and Decker. It does not have the retail footprint of Craftsman. And it is not a story about the market rewarding the right decision. The market rewarded the cheaper option almost every time. It is a story about ownership, about what happens when the people who make the decisions are the same people who have to live with them, not just for a quarter, not just for a fiscal year, but for a generation. When you cannot sell the company and walk away, you make different decisions. When your name is on the building and your children are going to inherit the outcome, the time horizon of every calculation changes. We lost Vise-Grip to a decision about ownership. We kept Channellock because of one. The mechanism is that simple. The consequences for two towns were not simple at all. Stand at the corner of South Main Street in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Close your eyes. It is 1886, and a 33-year-old blacksmith is hand-forging tools in a Pennsylvania winter, betting a year's work on the quality of what he can make. It is 1933, and an engineer named Howard Manning is sketching a tongue and groove channel that will outlast everything around it. It is 1957, and the first pair of blue-handled pliers is coming out of a dip tank, and the color is setting on the steel. It is 1980, and Bill DeArmond is walking onto the factory floor for his first day as president, with no idea that he will still be there 45 years later. It is 2008, and the workers of DeWitt, Nebraska are clocking out for the last time, and a factory 800 miles east is quietly making a different decision. It is 2023, and a sixth-generation DeArmond is learning the product line that his great-great-great-grandfather invented out of dissatisfaction with what already existed. Open your eyes. The building is still there. The forge is running. The blue handles are coming out of the dip tank. 325 people are coming to work this morning in the same town, making the same thing. 140 years, 6 generations. One Pennsylvania town. The hammers are still falling. 140 years, 6 generations, one Pennsylvania town. The hammers are still falling. But survival does not always look the same. Sometimes it looks like a factory that refuses to move. Sometimes it looks like a family that refuses to sell. And sometimes it looks like packing everything you built over 100 years into trucks and driving across 3 state lines, because the place where you started no longer wants you there. This is Buck Knives, and this is where the story starts to change. Stand at 660 South Loxa Street in Post Falls, Idaho, early on a Tuesday morning, and you will smell it before you see it. Cutting oil, warm steel, the dry bite of grinding dust on cold northern air. Walk through the front doors of a 128,000 square foot building and the sound hits next. Belt grinders running in steady rotation. The low mechanical hum of ceramic tumblers rolling batches of finished blades. And somewhere deeper in the plant, the hiss of a cryogenic freeze chamber dropping a rack of blade blanks to 110 degrees below zero. 320 people work inside these walls. They have been making knives here for 20 years. And somewhere inside this building, the 15 millionth Model 110 Folding Hunter has already been made. But there was a morning in January 2003 when the man whose family name is stamped on every single one of those blades sat down at a desk in El Cajon, California, and faced a decision that most American manufacturers never survive. He was not deciding whether to close the company. He was deciding where it would live and whether it would still be American when it got there. This is the story of how Buck Knives left California to save itself, while the rest of the American cutlery industry simply disappeared. To understand what Buck Knives became, you have to start with a 13-year-old boy in Leavenworth, Kansas, in the year 1902. His name was Hoyt Heath Buck, and he was a blacksmith's apprentice. Not a hobbyist, not a curious kid with a project. An apprentice, which in 1902 meant he was handed rough steel, a forge, and a fire, and told to make something that would hold. The problem Hoyt kept running into was the same one every farmer in Kansas knew by heart: grub hoes and reaping blades dulled too fast. The steel was inconsistent. Some sections held an edge through a full day of fieldwork. Others crumbled within hours. Hoyt began experimenting with the way the metal was heated before quenching, applying heat uniformly, holding the temperature longer, watching the color shift from red to orange to a particular shade of straw that told him the steel was ready. He tested the results with his thumbnail. He tested them on rope. He reworked the failures and kept the lessons. He was not working from a textbook. He was working from a fire and his own 2 hands. And by the time he was 15 years old, Hoyt Buck had taught himself a tempering process that produced edges his peers could not explain, and his customers could not stop buying. That knowledge lived in his hands for the next 4 decades. He spent those years as a logger, a sawmill millwright, and eventually an ordained Assembly of God pastor in Mountain Home, Idaho. He built furniture. He sharpened tools. He repaired equipment for ranchers who could not afford to replace it. He lived quietly in the high desert of the Intermountain West, carrying a craft that the world had not yet asked him to scale. And it is worth stopping here for a moment before the fame and the factory and the 15 million knives to notice what Hoyt's story contains. A secret born in poverty, developed in isolation, and carried in a single set of hands for 40 years. What he had discovered, a repeatable process for getting exceptional performance from ordinary steel, was eventually something that any trained metallurgist could learn. The knowledge was not magic, it was method. And method in American manufacturing has a way of becoming portable. The question the Buck family would spend the next century answering was whether the people who carried that method could stay together while the world tried to pull them apart. The world began pulling in December of 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and within weeks, the federal government issued a call to American citizens: donate fixed blade hunting knives to servicemen shipping overseas. Hoyt Buck did not have any knives to donate, but he had a forge and he had a church. He set up a small shop in the basement of the Mountain Home Assembly of God, began making knives from worn-out mill files he bought for almost nothing, and started selling them to soldiers stationed at the nearby Mountain Home Army Air Corps base. "I didn't have any knives," he later said, "but I sure knew how to make them." That sentence contains the whole company. In 1945, Hoyt's health failed. He moved south to San Diego to be near his son Alfred Charles Buck, a former Navy man who had fallen in love with the California coast and settled in the flat neighborhoods east of the city. 2 years later, Al nailed a 10 by 12 foot lean-to onto the side of his garage on Moreno Boulevard, and H. Buck and Son was open for business. Raw material was worn-out files salvaged from the dumpsters of the Consolidated Vultee aircraft plant nearby. Convair, the company building B-24 bombers for the war effort, purchased at a penny apiece. Hoyt worked the forge. Al worked the floor. They sold to local butchers. They sold to hunters. They sold to anyone who needed an edge that would hold. Hoyt died in 1949, still at the grinder, and Al carried on alone. The late 1950s nearly ended everything. Al would say later that he came within a gnat's eyebrow of quitting, that for a stretch, the Buck family made more money sharpening neighborhood lawnmower blades than making knives. An advertising man refused to run more ads until the bill was paid. Al's mother loaned him money and logged it in the ledger as a loan. A local pastor connected him to Howard Craig, a manufacturing executive at Ryan Aeronautical, who helped attract outside investors. On April 7, 1961, Buck Knives was formally chartered. The lean-to was gone. A real factory was coming. And it is worth pausing here on how close it came to never happening, because the company that would eventually put its name on 15 million folding knives almost folded in the garage where it started. The near death of the 1950s was not an accident. It was the first warning that building a company on a single man's craft, in a single city, with no institutional protection, was a bet that required everything to go right. Everything did not always go right. The knife that saved everything began with a board resolution. On April 18, 1963, the Buck Knives Board of Directors voted to authorize development of a new folding hunting knife, one strong enough to replace a fixed-blade sheath knife in the field. The engineer who solved the mechanical problem was a man named Guy Husser, described by company historian Tom Abels as an eccentric who could do more with baling wire and second-hand scrap iron than most men could do with a fully equipped shop. What Husser designed was a rocker bar lockback, a spring-loaded mechanism that locked the blade rigidly open until the user depressed a lever at the back of the handle. It was mechanically simple. It was structurally sound. And Buck made the decision, one of the most consequential decisions in American manufacturing history, not to patent it. The reasons are debated. The cost of a patent filing, the urgency of getting to market, the belief that the design was too simple to protect. Whatever the logic, the result was this. The Buck 110 Folding Hunter became the single most copied folding knife design ever produced, and because anyone could copy it, the term buck knife passed into the American language as the generic name for any folding lockback, regardless of who made it or where. That is the rare fate of a thing that is so right it becomes invisible. You stop seeing it as a product, you see it as a given. The first 255 Model 110s shipped in the fourth quarter of 1964. By 1968, Buck's sales had grown 950% in 5 years. The knife was everywhere. Hardware stores, sporting goods counters, Army-Navy surplus shops, hunting catalogs, the back pockets of farmers and electricians, and forest rangers who had never thought about knives before but could not imagine working without one now. The 1 in 10 cost more than the competition, $12 to $20, when a comparable fixed blade sold for $5, and it sold anyway. Because Buck paired that price with something no other American knife maker had offered, an unconditional lifetime guarantee. We warranty each and every Buck knife to be free of defects in material and workmanship for the life of the knife. Not 1 year, not 5 years, the life of the knife. The forever warranty. It was the most expensive promise in American manufacturing. And it was a promise that made perfect sense in 1964, when the American knife market was largely domestic, when the distance between what an American factory spent to make a knife and what an overseas factory would one day spend to make the same knife was still a theoretical problem. In 1964, the forever warranty was a competitive advantage. What Chuck Buck, who joined his father Al in the 1950s and would take over as president in 1979, could not have known was that by the 1990s, the forever warranty would be a chain, a promise that Buck could not break, and that its competitors, selling Chinese-made knives at a quarter of Buck's production cost, had never made in the first place. If you ever carried a buck knife on your belt before a hunting trip, you know exactly what the Model 110 meant to a generation of American men. The weight of it, just over 7 ounces, solid in a way that felt like intention, not accident. The brass bolsters catching the morning light, the click of the blade locking open, a sound that was entirely its own, a sound that meant ready. You probably received that knife as a gift, a father, a grandfather, an uncle who had carried his for 20 years and decided you were old enough for one now. Buck became so woven into the ritual of American outdoor life that researchers began finding the 110 in time capsules, in inheritance boxes, in the breast pockets of men who had never traded up and never needed to. The brand entered American culture the way a few things do, not as advertising, but as fact. By 1980, Buck had broken ground on a facility designed to match its own legend. The new plant at 1900 Weld Boulevard in El Cajon was 200,000 square feet under one roof, on 10 acres of East County land, and it was built to look like a European hunting lodge. Stone facade, heavy timber details, because Chuck Buck believed the building should say something about the company inside it. At peak production, 600 people worked in that building. They ran 3 shifts. They operated a machine shop, a heat treatment facility, a grinding room, a handle assembly floor, a ceramic tumbling operation, and a quality control line that hand-tested every blade before it left. Paul Boss, a heat treatment specialist who would eventually have his name stamped on Buck's premium blades as a personal guarantee of quality, was refining the 3-stage proprietary process that began with high heat austenitizing, dropped the steel into a cryogenic freeze at -110 degrees Fahrenheit, and finished with a precise temper cycle. The result was edge performance that competitors who paid for the same steel grades could not consistently reproduce. The knowledge was still in the hands. It had simply been systematized. In 1982, Buck signed a distribution deal with Kmart. In 1987, the United States Army awarded Buck the contract to manufacture the M9 bayonet, 315,600 units for American soldiers. The company that began in a 10x12 lean-to was arming the military. And the man whose grandfather had made knives from dumpster files in San Diego was now running a 200,000 square foot manufacturing operation that employed half the adult population of some small American towns. The Kmart deal, at the time, felt like a rival. In retrospect, it was a door opening onto a corridor that only went one direction. Entering mass retail meant Buck now competed on shelves controlled by buyers whose only job was to push prices lower every season. The same retailers who gave Buck national reach would spend the next 2 decades demanding that it compete with products it could not match on cost without becoming something it was not. The chain was already attached. It just had not gone teut yet. One decision changed everything. It happened on January 15, 2003. C.J. Buck, 4th generation and president. Since 1999, the man whose given name was Charles Joseph and who had started on the production line building 110 folding hunters in 1978 had been watching the numbers deteriorate for 8 years. Buck's annual sales had fallen 25% since 1995. The workforce had dropped from 600 workers to 250. The company was losing money. The Chinese knife industry had spent the previous decade building manufacturing capacity that produced folding knives at roughly a quarter of what it cost Buck to make them in California. Major retailers were leaning on every American knife company to cut prices or lose shelf space. In the year 2000, under pressure from those same retailers, Buck had opened a contract manufacturing facility in China. It was not an expansion. It was a tourniquet applied to a wound that was still bleeding. And then California made its position clear. In January 2001, Governor Gray Davis, the man who had campaigned on protecting California's workers while presiding over an energy market that had been deregulated into chaos, declared a state of emergency as rolling blackouts moved through the California power grid. For most businesses, an unplanned blackout meant lost productivity and ruined inventory. For Buck Knives, it meant something more specific. The 3-stage heat treatment process, the thing that separated a Buck blade from every Chinese-made imitation, required consistent, uninterrupted electrical power. You could not pause a cryogenic freeze cycle. You could not restart an austenitizing oven after an unscheduled outage and trust that the steel had been treated uniformly. The energy crisis did not stop the El Cajon plant, but it made visible, in a way that quarterly reports never had, how dependent Buck's most critical competitive advantage was on a power grid it did not control and a state government that was not interested in solving the problem. The second pressure was workers' compensation insurance. California's workers' compensation rates ran approximately 3 times what Idaho charged. The third came in November 2002, after statewide elections that C.J. Buck later said publicly removed his last reason to believe the California business climate would improve. The family had watched those results and reached a conclusion. The state was not changing direction, and Buck could not survive on the current course. In January 2003, Chuck Buck, 66 years old, chairman of the board, the man who had built Weld Boulevard, who had signed the Kmart deal, who had won the Bayonet contract, who had spent more than 4 decades building the company his grandfather started in a church basement, authorized the announcement. Buck Knives was leaving California. C.J. Buck called his El Cajon employees together and told them the truth as plainly as he could. No more than a quarter of the workforce, approximately 60 people, would be offered relocation packages to Post Falls, Idaho. The rest, roughly 190 men and women who had been building Buck Knives in San Diego's East County, some of them for years, some for decades, would not be making the move. The jobs they had held were staying in the building while they were not. CJ later said that he wrestled with how much notice to give. We ran the risk of giving too much notice and possibly losing people while we still needed them. That's a chance we decided to take. It was a careful calculation by a man trying to save the company. 190 people is not a calculation. 190 people is a neighborhood. The move happened in 2 waves of more than 50 tractor trailers. 1,400 miles north on Interstate 15 through the Mojave and up through the Pacific Northwest into the Idaho Panhandle. CNC machines, ceramic tumblers, belt grinders, Paul Boss's entire heat treatment operation, disassembled, palletized, driven north, and reassembled in a 128,000 square foot building on 12 acres of Post Falls industrial land. The ribbon cutting at 660 South Loxa Street was held on May 21, 2005. The Idaho Commerce Department had offered $3,000 per employee in training subsidies. The land cost approximately $800,000. The annual savings from the move were more than $1.2 million, with the largest portion coming from workers' compensation alone. The math was sound. The decision saved the company. And 6 years later, in August 2009, C.J. Buck stood in front of approximately 200 Post Falls employees, people who had uprooted their lives, who had left California to follow the factory north, and told them he was cutting everyone's pay by 10%, including his own. It was intended to position the company if the economy did not improve. The men and women who had made the move, who had taken the bet, took the cut. Nobody walked out. The factory stayed open. While Buck was loading its tractor trailers, another American knife company was watching the same pressures accumulate and making a different calculation. Imperial Schrade Corporation had roots going back to the 19th century, a roll-up of several storied American cutlery brands, including the Ulster Knife Company and the original Schrade Cutlery Works, all eventually headquartered in Ellenville, New York. Old-timer pocket knives, Uncle Henry hunting knives, the Schrade name itself. Brands that sat on the same shelf as Buck in every sporting goods store in America, carried by the same hunters, given by the same fathers. In early 2001, Schrade had approximately 700 employees in Ellenville, a small town of 4,130 people at the foot of the Catskill Mountains. By the end of 2003, layoffs had reduced that number to 382. In December of that year, 120 workers were let go without advance notice, just before Christmas. Some were called back in the spring, most were not. On July 29, 2004, Schrade President Walter Gardner sent his remaining workers a letter. 1 page. The last day of employment would be July 30th. 250 people. 1 day. Ellenville had just lost the company that had employed its families for generations in the time it took to read a single page. Schrade filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy that September. The brand names, Oldtimer, Uncle Henry, Schrade, were sold at auction for $8.6 million to Taylor Brands of Tennessee. Taylor Brands sold them to Smith & Wesson in 2016. Smith & Wesson moved production to China. The knives are still on the shelves today, at prices the Ellenville factory could never have matched, with names that once meant something specific and now mean nothing except that someone owns the trademark. Buck did not lose its factory to an investor group that bought the brand and walked away from the building. It did not lose its workers to a corporate board that calculated the name was worth more without the people attached to it. Buck lost California and chose to move the entire factory north, rather than let go of either the name or the hands behind it. Before the close, where Buck stands now. In 2024, C.J. Buck made a decision that may matter as much as the Idaho move. He hired the first non-family president in the company's history, Lane Tobiasen, a veteran of Smith & Wesson's firearms division and former head of Lacrosse footwear. CJ's public explanation for the hire is one of the most honest things any fourth-generation owner has said about succession. One of the things I had wished was that my father had put someone between he and I. When he was ready to retire, I wasn't ready. He was not going to repeat that. His son Josh is in the building, learning the work from a man who knows how to run a manufacturing company without the weight of the family name on his shoulders. In January 2025, at SHOT Show in Las Vegas, Buck unveiled the Range series, the company's first crossbar lock folder, going directly into competition with Benchmade and Spyderco for the modern everyday carry market. A company that built its identity on the Model 110 was now engineering for a customer who carries a knife to the office as much as to the field. In May 2025, Buck held a private gathering at the Post Falls plant and marked 20 years in Idaho. CJ brought together every worker who had made the original move from El Cajon and gave each one a commemorative knife, made in the building they had helped save, stamped with the name they had carried north. Stand at 660 South Loxa Street, Post Falls, Idaho. Close your eyes. Hear the belt grinders, steady and low. Smell the cutting oil and the cold air rolling out of the cryogenic chamber. Feel, in your palm, the weight of a finished blade, warm from the grinding wheel, solid in a way that asks to be used, with a name pressed into the steel that belongs to a specific family, in a specific building on a specific street, in a town that almost never existed. Now, open your eyes. The building is still there. 320 people work inside it. The knives are still made in the United States of America. They did not save the factory by selling it. They did not save the name by moving it to a cheaper country and hoping no one would notice. They drove it north on 50 tractor trailers for 1,400 miles, and they built it again from scratch, and they have been building it ever since. In an industry that learned how to put American names on Chinese blades, the Buck family learned something different. They learned that the name on the knife is only worth what the hands behind it are worth. So they kept the hands. Buck knives moved. 190 people did not make the trip, but the factory survived. Not every brand gets that choice. The next company on this list did not face a hostile government or a corporate acquisition. They faced something smaller, something that cost $5, something that fit in the palm of your hand, and it was enough to end everything they had spent 40 years building. This is Maglite, and this is what it looks like when the world changes faster than a brand can. There is a low building on South Hellman Avenue in Ontario, California, about 50 miles east of Los Angeles. From the road, it looks like nothing. Pale walls, a flat roof, the kind of building you drive past without ever seeing. But step inside, and the first thing that reaches you is the smell. Cutting oil, warm and metallic. Then the sound, not a roar, but a steady, patient rhythm. The sound of machines shaving solid aluminum into shape, one part at a time. In 1999, this single factory turned out 39 million flashlights in 1 year. At its height, the brand built here accounted for 1 out of every $4 Americans spent on flashlights. Police officers carried it. Soldiers carried it. It sat in the kitchen drawer of nearly every house in the country, and when the power went out, it was the first thing a father's hand reached for in the dark. That brand is Maglite. And if you are old enough to remember a flashlight that felt like it had been machined from a single bar of metal, heavy, cold, serious in your hand, then you already know exactly what we are talking about. For 30 years, Maglite did not just lead the American flashlight market. It was the empire. And then, in the space of a single decade, that empire came apart. Not because the company shipped its factory to China, not because a corporate raider bought it and stripped it for parts. Maglite is still here. The factory on South Hellman Avenue is still running. The founder still walks the floor. And that is what makes this story so strange. Because everything that destroyed Maglite's empire can be held in the palm of your hand. And it cost about $5. What happened to Maglite is already happening to American brands you have not even thought about yet. To understand how it fell, you first have to understand the man who built it. Because for 50 years, Maglite was never really a company. It was one man's hands. Anthony Maglica was born in New York City in November of 1930, in the worst year of the Great Depression. His mother, a Croatian immigrant, took him back to the old country as a boy, to a small island called Zlarin off the coast of Croatia. He grew up there through the Second World War, through occupation, through hunger. He would say later, plainly, without any drama, that he had stood in front of a firing squad, that he had gone barefoot, that he had survived things no child should ever have to survive. In 1950, at 19 years old, he came back to America with almost no English and no money. His first job was piecework in a New York sweatshop, sewing for 50 cents an hour. He drifted west to California, found work as a machinist, and discovered the one thing he was extraordinary at, making metal do exactly what he wanted it to do, to a tolerance finer than a human hair. In 1955, he scraped together $125, put it down on a used metal lathe, and opened a one-man machine shop in a Los Angeles garage. For more than 20 years, that is all the company was. Tony Maglica, alone, machining precision parts for other people's products, for industry, for aerospace, for the military. He was a subcontractor. He made the small, perfect pieces that went inside things with other companies' names stamped on them. Hold on to that detail. The man who would build America's most recognizable flashlight spent the first half of his working life making things no one would ever know he had made. The flashlight came almost by accident. Maglica had been machining parts for a flashlight manufacturer, and he was not impressed by what he saw. Flashlights in the 1970s were, frankly, junk. Flimsy stamped tin and cheap plastic, the kind of object you bought already knowing it would fail you. Maglica looked at that and saw an insult. He believed a flashlight should be a tool, a serious one, something a police officer could stake his life on in the dark. In 1979, he introduced it, the original Maglite. The body was machined from solid aircraft-grade aluminum, hard anodized inside and out so it would never corrode. You focused the beam by twisting the head. It was sealed against water, and it was, quite deliberately, heavy, and that weight told you something every single time you picked it up. This was not disposable. This was built to last a lifetime. And here's the part to remember. The thing that made the early Maglite untouchable was not only the aluminum, it was a patent. United States Patent Number 4,286,311, filed in 1978, protected the design at its very core. For more than 2 decades, that single patent stood like a wall around the company. No one could legally build a Maglite but Maglite. A wall is a wonderful thing to stand behind. It is also a wonderful thing to forget you are depending on. By 1982, the one-man garage was gone. Maglite moved his company into a real factory in Ontario, California, 126,000 square feet, with 80 workers. And he ran that factory the same way he had run the lathe in the garage. Everything in-house. Everything machined from raw bar stock, on his own floor, by his own people, to his own standard. Walk that factory floor in the 1980s and you would understand the company in an instant. The smell of cutting fluid hanging in the air, the chatter of dozens of machines, long racks of aluminum tubes moving from station to station, cut, bored, threaded, anodized, assembled, inspected. Tony Maglite designed much of the tooling himself. He inspected the products himself. Nothing left that building that he had not, in some sense, touched. It was a beautiful way to build a flashlight. Slow, deliberate, controlled from the raw metal all the way to the finished tool. It produced an object of real quality, and the customer could feel it the moment it was in their hand. But a company built entirely around one man's hands and one man's standard carries a hidden cost. It can only move as fast as that one man can turn. It can only change direction when that one man decides to turn the wheel. For 30 years, that was the secret of Maglite's quality. The day the world began to change faster than Tony Maglite, it would become the thing that nearly sank him. For now, though, the world was not changing faster than Tony Maglite. The world was buying everything he could make. In 1984, Maglite released a product that turned a successful company into a household name, the Mini Maglite. A flashlight the size of a fountain pen, running on 2 AA batteries, with the same machined aluminum body and the same focusing beam as its full-size brother, shrunk down to slip into a shirt pocket, a glove box, a purse. If you are old enough, you owned one. You know exactly the one I mean. The black anodized finish, slightly cool against your fingers, the faint knurling on the grip. The small, satisfying click as you twisted the head, and the beam tightened from a wide flood to a sharp white circle. You kept it in the junk drawer in the kitchen. Your father kept one in the truck. It was the flashlight you could hand a child and trust them not to break. The Mini Maglite did not just sell, it created a category. Before it, a personal flashlight was barely a product at all. After it, every hardware store in America had an entire wall of them. By the late 1980s, Maglite was no longer competing in the flashlight market. It was the standard against which everything else was measured. The Wall Street Journal called it the Cadillac of flashlights. When the chief executive of Apple Computer wanted to describe the ambition he had for his own company, he used the same comparison. He said he wanted Apple to be the Maglite of computers. Think about that for a moment. A flashlight had become a measure of excellence for one of the most famous technology companies on Earth. Police departments across the country issued Maglites as standard equipment. The long, heavy D-cell model rode in the door of nearly every patrol car in America. Soldiers carried them, mechanics, electricians, security guards. Every working man who needed light he could rely on reached for the same name. In 1999, that factory in Ontario produced 39 million flashlights. By the end of the decade, the company was worth somewhere in the range of $750 million. If you ever stood in a hardware store in 1995 and chose a flashlight, you almost certainly chose this one. It did not even feel like a choice. It felt like the only serious answer to the question. And Maglite told you why, in the most famous advertisement it ever made. A Maglite is set down in the path of a fully loaded Mack truck. The truck rolls straight over it. The flashlight is dug out of the asphalt, switched on, and it works. It is frozen solid inside a block of ice. Thawed out, switched on, it works. The message was simple, and it was true. This thing will not break. On and on, the tagline said. On and on. That promise was the foundation of the entire empire. Maglite was indestructible. Maglite would outlive you. But look closely at that promise, because there is something hidden inside it. Everything Maglite promised you was about the body, the aluminum, the toughness, the shell that could survive a truck. Maglite had spent 30 years perfecting the part of the flashlight that holds the light. It had spent almost no time at all thinking about the light itself. And there was one more crack, hidden inside all that success, a crack running straight through the family. For more than 20 years, beginning in 1971, Tony Maglite had a partner. Her name was Claire. She took his last name, although the two of them never married. She worked beside him as the company's corporate secretary while Maglite grew from a garage into an empire. And in 1992, she discovered that Tony had quietly arranged for all of it, every share of the company, to pass to his children from an earlier marriage when he died. She would receive nothing. Claire sued. In 1994, a California jury, looking at a company now worth a fortune, awarded her $84 million, at the time one of the largest verdicts of its kind in the state's history. It was front-page news. The case went up on appeal, the verdict was overturned, and years later the two sides settled for a smaller figure. But the lesson of it was carved permanently into the company. Maglite was Tony Maglite. It was his to control, his to keep, his to hand down, and he would fight anyone, in a courtroom if he had to keep it that way. No outside investors, no board of directors to answer to, no shareholders demanding that he change. For 30 years, that total control had been the secret of the company's integrity. It was about to become the reason it could not save itself. One decision changed everything. It happened in 2004. And it did not happen in a boardroom, or on a factory floor, or in a courtroom. It happened on a street in Los Angeles, in the dark, and it was caught on camera by a news helicopter. On the night of June 23, 2004, Los Angeles police stopped a car theft suspect named Stanley Miller. After Miller had surrendered, an officer struck him 11 times with a long, heavy metal flashlight. The footage played on every television in America. And the flashlight in that footage, the 2-pound aluminum baton in the officer's hand, was the very thing Maglite had spent 25 years making famous. Its toughness, its weight, the strength that had survived a Mack truck. Within weeks, the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, William Bratton, a man who had already rebuilt policing in New York City and carried a national reputation as the most influential police reformer in America, announced that the department would move away from the large flashlight entirely. Officers would carry a smaller light, one that could not be swung as a weapon. And the LAPD was the most imitated police force in the country. Where it led, hundreds of departments followed. A waiting list of more than 1,000 police agencies formed to evaluate the replacement. And the replacement was not a Maglite. Here is the strange, quiet truth of it. The first thing that cracked Maglite's empire was not a cheaper competitor. It was Maglite's own greatest strength. Its indestructible, weaponizable weight suddenly turned against it. The toughness that had built the brand became a liability the very moment it was filmed, striking a man in the dark. But losing the police was only the wound. It was not the thing that killed the empire. To understand that, you have to look at what was already waiting to walk through the door that Maglite had just left standing open. While Maglite had been perfecting aluminum, a completely different revolution had been happening somewhere else, in light itself. For 100 years, a flashlight worked one way. Electricity heated a thin wire inside a glass bulb until it glowed. It was the same basic technology Edison had used. It was the technology inside every Maglite ever built. And it was about to become obsolete. In May 2001, a company called LumaLEDs introduced something new, a power LED. A light-emitting diode finally bright enough, for the first time, to truly light a room. It used a fraction of the electricity of a glass bulb. It did not burn out. It did not shatter. It would run for tens of thousands of hours. And crucially, it was tiny, and it was getting cheaper every single year. A new kind of company rose up to build flashlights around it. Not in America, in Shenzhen, China. A firm called Phoenix began selling LED flashlights in 2001. Another, called Olight, followed in 2007. They were not weighed down by 100 years of habit, or a factory built around machining aluminum, or one founder's lifetime of expertise in a technology that was now dying. They simply built the new thing. And the new thing was not just a little better. It was humiliatingly better. A cheap LED flashlight out of China, costing a fraction of the price of a Maglite, could be many times brighter, run far longer on the same batteries, and never need its bulb replaced. The gap was not a gap, it was a canyon. And in 2005, the wall came down. United States Patent 4,286,311, the patent that had protected the Maglite design for more than 2 decades, expired in March 2005. The legal wall around the company was simply gone. A congressman from Maglite's own district tried to pass a bill to extend it. The bill failed. And now, at the exact moment a cheaper and better technology was pouring in from overseas, anyone in the world was free to build something that looked and worked like a Maglite. This is where the $5 object comes in. As LED technology spread, a small industry appeared selling LED bulbs designed to drop straight into an old incandescent Maglite. For about $5, you could take the flashlight already sitting in your kitchen drawer and make it many times brighter, with batteries that lasted far longer. You did not need to buy a new Maglite. You did not, in fact, need to buy any flashlight at all. Maglite did respond. It released its own LED models, but not until 2006, 5 full years after Phoenix had started. In a technology race measured in months, Maglite arrived half a decade late, still carrying a factory built for a different century. And then came the final blow, the one that needed no factory at all. The smartphone. By the year 2010 and into the decade that followed, nearly every adult in America was carrying a flashlight in their pocket every hour of every day, and they had not paid 1 extra cent for it. The everyday flashlight, the impulse purchase, the junk drawer mini Maglite that had built the company an entire category, simply stopped being something people needed to buy. You can see the cost of all of this most clearly in one number and one building, in Ontario, California. In 2004, the very same year the Los Angeles Police Department turned away, Maglite had been planning for a future of growth. The company announced an enormous expansion, a vast new facility built to hold a workforce of 2,400 people by 2006. The building went up. The workforce never came. The future it had been built for never arrived. Instead, in 2009, Tony Maglite had to do the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. The company lost nearly $11 million that year, and for the first time ever, Maglite laid off its workers, around 200 of them. Maglite, by then approaching 80 years old, called it the saddest thing he had ever had to do. This was a man who had stood in front of a firing squad as a boy. Letting 200 of his own people go was the thing that broke his heart. These were not executives. They were machinists, assemblers, and inspectors. Many of them people who had given the company decades of their lives. Men like Jim Zucchini, who would spend more than 36 years inside that company. They had built the most trusted flashlight in America with their own hands. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply been standing inside a factory when the technology it was built around quietly died. Now, it would be easy to stand here and say that Tony Maglite should have seen it coming, that he should have moved to LED faster, should have chased the Chinese manufacturers down on price, should have read the market and turned the wheel in time. But look honestly at the decision in front of him, and it is not so simple. Maglite had built something real. A factory of American workers, machining American aluminum, making a product good enough to be displayed in design museums in Japan and Germany. To chase the new market on price, he would have had to do what nearly every competitor did: move production to Asia, abandon the factory, and abandon the workers. He refused. Flatly. He said, in plain words, that he would not go to China and make another country rich while making his own country poor. And to switch overnight to LED, he would have had to throw away 30 years of tooling, 30 years of expertise, the entire vertically integrated factory that was the whole identity of the company. On a spreadsheet, the right answer was obvious: move offshore, cut the workforce, chase the cheap light. Every single number pointed that way. But a spreadsheet cannot measure what Tony Maglite was actually protecting. It cannot measure 36 years of one machinist's working life. It cannot weigh a promise made to a workforce, to a town, to a country. Maglite looked at the cheap, fast, offshore answer, and he decided that saving the margin was not worth becoming the kind of company he had spent his whole life refusing to be. He may have lost the empire, but he was not willing to lose that. To see the road Maglite did not take, you only have to look a little further down the California coast. In 1979, the very same year Tony Maglite introduced the original Maglite, another flashlight company was founded in California. It was called Surefire, and it would go on to face exactly the same world Maglite faced, the same LED revolution, the same flood of cheap competitors, the same old technology collapsing underneath it. Surefire made a different choice. It never tried to be the flashlight in everyone's kitchen drawer. It went the opposite direction. It built the most advanced tactical lights in the world, embraced the new lighting technology early instead of late, and bound itself to the buyers who would always pay for the very best: elite military units, federal agents, special operations. Sure, Fire did not have 100-year-old technology to defend. It treated the new light as an opportunity. Maglite treated it as a threat. And so the truth of what happened to Maglite is not what it looks like from a distance. Maglite did not lose its empire because its product was bad. The flashlights it makes today are still excellent. It did not lose it because a corporation bought the company and gutted it. No one ever did. It did not even lose it simply to China. Maglite lost its empire because the world stopped wanting the one thing it was perfect at. And the company had been built, from the raw metal up, around a single man who could not bear to let that perfect thing go. Maglite is still here. That is the part that surprises people. The factory on South Hellman Avenue in Ontario is still running. It still machines every flashlight from solid aluminum. It still employs around 800 American workers, far fewer than the 2,400 once dreamed of, but 800 real jobs are still there. Tony Maglite is still there too, As of today, he is 95 years old and he still comes into work. He still inspects the products. Nothing new ships without his approval. Beside him now is his son Anthony Maglite Jr., slowly taking up the work. The first real sign that the company is preparing for a day its founder will not see. In January of 2025, when the Palisades fire swept through the neighborhoods west of Los Angeles, a man named Andrew Grinsfelder stayed through the night running a generator to protect his home from the flames. He lit the darkness around him with a Maglite. The company shared his story publicly. It was a small moment, but it was exactly the moment the flashlight was always built for. The emergency, the outage, the night when the power fails and you need the one thing that refuses to quit. Maglite did not die, but the empire did. The brand that once held one out of every 4 flashlight dollars in America is now one name among hundreds, most of them brighter, most of them cheaper, most of them made somewhere else. So stand for a moment outside that low building on South Hellman Avenue. Close your eyes. It is 1995. The air smells of cutting oil. Inside, hundreds of machines are turning, and 39 million flashlights a year are flowing out the doors to every hardware store and every squad car and every kitchen drawer in the country. And every single one of them is the answer. The only serious answer. The flashlight America reaches for in the dark. Now open your eyes. The factory is still standing. The lights are still on. The old man is still inside, still working, still refusing to let go. And the flashlight in your pocket, the one that is brighter than anything he ever built, does not have his name on it. It is your phone. Maglite did not die, but the empire did. And after 4 stories, a garage inventor, a Pennsylvania family, a knife company that drove across 3 states, and a flashlight empire that the world left behind, it would be easy to walk away believing that holding on is simply not enough anymore. The last brand on this list has been holding on since 1923, not holding on to a name, not holding on to a logo licensed to a factory in another country, holding on to the actual building, the actual machines, the actual workers in the actual city where the first hammer was made over 100 years ago. No acquisition, no outsourcing, no compromise. This is Estwing, and this is what 100 years of holding the line looks like. Every year, millions of hammers break at the same point, where the head meets the handle. One tool eliminated that joint entirely. Forged from a single bar of steel, the head and handle are one continuous piece. It has not fundamentally changed since 1923. It has outlived cheaper imports, composite materials, and an entire culture of disposable buying. 100 years later, America's one-piece hammer refuses to die, and the reason has less to do with steel than with the Swedish immigrants' stubborn idea about what a tool owes the hand that holds it. Ernest Otto Estwing was born on the Swedish island of Åland in 1884, the son of a limestone worker. Growing up surrounded by stone and sea, he learned early how much depended on the strength of your tools. At 21, Ernest boarded the SS Martha Washington with his sister Maria, arriving at Ellis Island in April 1906. Their destination was Rockford, Illinois, a city already humming with the noise of lathes, presses, and Swedish voices. In those first years, Ernest took whatever work he could find, listed as a machinist in Rockford's city directory by 1912. He married Anna Lindstrom, became a naturalized citizen, and enrolled in night school to master English and the machinist's craft. The 1916 bulletin from Rockford Technical Institute records his graduation, a certificate in machinist trades earned after long shifts and longer nights. He worked at Remington, assembling rifle mechanisms, and then at Bridgeport Machine Tool Company, where his hands shaped steel for hours on end. In those factories, Ernest saw the same failure again and again. A hammer's head flying loose, a wooden handle splintering after a few months of hard use. For men who built their lives with their hands, a tool that failed was more than an inconvenience. It was a betrayal. By 1923, Ernest had saved enough to file incorporation papers for Estwing Manufacturing Company. The address on the document was his own basement in Rockford. The founding promise was simple, almost stubborn. A one-piece hammer forged from a single piece of steel, head and handle as one. No joints, no glue, nothing to come loose. A tool that would last as long as the man who swung it. The first hammers were made by hand, one at a time, for local carpenters and stonemasons. Ernest's idea wasn't born from market research or advertising. It came from years of watching tools break and believing, quietly but fiercely, that the hand deserved better. In the basement workshop, the one-piece hammer began as a solution to a problem no one else seemed willing to solve. The steel was cold and hard, but the motive behind it was deeply human. A craftsman's answer to the question of what a tool owes its user. In the spring of 1925, a bold headline appeared in the pages of the American Machinist. A hammer that won't break. The Estwing one-piece steel hammer. The ad spoke directly to union carpenters, promising a tool that would never splinter, never send a head flying across the job site, and never betray the hands that swung it. For carpenters who spent their days on scaffolds and rooftops, hammers were more than implements. They were extensions of muscle and memory. The promise of a hammer that could outlast a career was enough to spark curiosity, and then something more. Within weeks, the company's order ledger told the story. Weekly receipts jumped from a dozen to nearly 70. The basement workshop, once quiet and methodical, filled with the clatter of steel and the hurried rhythm of new demand. Local hardware stores began to ask for shipments by the crate. Word spread through union halls and job sites. There was a new hammer in town, and it didn't break. The orders kept coming. By the summer of 1925, Ernest Estwing faced a problem that most inventors only dream about. He couldn't keep up. The surge forced a decision. He acquired the old H.J. Brody and Company building at 1200 East State Street, filing city permits for a $12,000 renovation that would install a drop forge, a heat treatment furnace, and a 150-ton press. The Rockford Register-Star called it a symbol of modern American industry. Inside the new plant, the hammer's journey changed. No longer just a craftsman's answer to a local problem, it became a product of scale, shaped by fire, steel, and the collective pride of a growing workforce. The union carpenters who first responded to that ad became the audience for a tool that now carried the weight of a promise, head and handle as one, built not just to last, but to endure. The Estwing hammer was no longer just a solution, it was becoming a standard. A single line of numbers and stamped steel changed the hammer's fate in America. On October 22, 1929, the United States Patent Office issued patent 1,707,787 to George Estwing, a legal document that would serve as both shield and sword for a new kind of tool. The patent described not just a hammer, but a principle, head and handle forged from the same bar of steel, the grain running unbroken from striking face to grip. No welds, no pins, no joinery to fail. The language was precise, even stubborn, about what could and could not be copied. Inside the file wrapper, the examiner's questions and Estwing's replies read like a chess match. Prior art was raised and dismissed. Amendments clarified that only a true single-piece forging, continuous grain from top to tail, would count. For any competitor, the message was clear. Shortcuts would not pass muster, not with the patent office, and not in the eyes of the tradesmen who had started to trust this new hammer. The patent was not just a technicality. It became a market moat, a line in the sand that Estwing's counsel defended with steady resolve. By 1935, cease and desist letters began landing on the desks of rival toolmakers. Some tried welding heads to shanks. Others cast the parts and pinned them together, but none could claim the uninterrupted steel that the patent demanded. When one competitor, Hammer Company, pushed too far, Estwing filed suit in federal court. The 1937 case, Estwing versus Hammer Company, centered on the core claim. Only a hammer forged in one piece, with continuous grain, could wear the mantle. The settlement came 2 years later, with Hammer Company agreeing to withdraw their product for a decade. Every legal maneuver was a signal to the market, to the hardware stores, to the men on the job site, that the one-piece hammer was more than a clever idea. It was protected property, and Estwing would not let it be diluted or knocked off. The patent's authority forced rivals to retreat to old habits, two-piece construction, wood handles, or welded joints. For Estwing, the legal stronghold did not just keep competitors at bay. It bought time to master the forging process in-house, to turn a patent claim into a daily reality on the factory floor. The hammer's promise was now written in both steel and law, and every swing on a job site echoed that guarantee. At the heart of Estwing's promise lies a simple, stubborn idea. A hammer is only as strong as its weakest joint. In the Rockford plant, that idea takes shape in a line of heat and steel, each step a ritual that trades brute force for trust. Steel bars, 5 feet long and cold to the touch, are racked above the furnace, waiting their turn. When the door opens, the air shimmers. The bars are pushed in and brought to a glowing orange, somewhere above 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, just shy of melting. At this temperature, the steel's grain structure loosens, ready to be shaped but not broken. A worker, sleeves rolled and face streaked with sweat, feeds the bar into a drop forge. The hammer's head, claw, and handle are pressed out in a single, violent stroke. There is no pause, no second chance. This is where the promise is. Forged. The grain of the steel runs unbroken from striking face to handle, a single path that will not split or loosen over time. James Ramos, who spent 35 years as a metallurgist at Estwing, once said, "The continuous grain forging eliminates the stress points you see in wood handle hammers. That is why the steel never cracks." Fresh from the forge, the hammer is still too hard for work. It is annealed, cooled slowly in a controlled oven, the way a craftsman tempers his own patience, to relieve internal stresses. Then comes the heat treat. The striking face is brought back up to temperature, then plunged into oil. This oil quench locks in a Rockwell hardness between 55 and 60 on the C scale. Hard enough to drive nails for decades, but not so brittle that the head will shatter. The rest of the hammer stays tough, able to flex and absorb shock. Once the steel is cooled, the piece is machined and polished by hand. The handle's grip recess is cut, the head is ground flat to within a few thousandths of an inch, and the surface is buffed to a satin sheen. At this stage, the hammer is nearly finished, but the story is not complete. The one-piece steel is a marvel of durability, but it comes with a trade-off. Every blow travels straight down the handle, sending vibration into the user's hand. The solution, leather wraps, vinyl grips, and later the shock reduction grip, would come later. For now, the hammer's promise is written in its grain. No welds, no glue, nothing to fail. Just steel, shaped by fire and pride, ready to outlast the man who swings it. The first Estwing hammers were all steel, unyielding, cold, and built to last. But even a tool that never breaks can feel harsh in the hand. By the early 1930s, Estwing's shop workers began experimenting with comfort. They cut strips of leather, stretched and wrapped them around the steel handles, then secured each grip with a single rivet near the end. The result was a handle that fit the palm like a well-worn glove, its surface warming over time and picking up the sweat and oil of daily work. Leather gave the hammer a sense of craft, a nod to the old ways, even as the rest of the tool looked forward. But leather had its limits. On rainy job sites, it could swell or stiffen. Years of use wore the edges smooth, sometimes slippery. By the 1960s, Estwing's engineers looked to new materials. They molded blue vinyl grips directly onto the steel, creating a seamless, weatherproof surface that could stand up to mud, sun, and winter cold. The blue handle became a signature, easy to spot on a crowded bench, impossible to mistake for anything else. Vinyl did not crack or rot, and it shrugged off rain and sweat. For many tradesmen, the feel of that blue grip meant a tool they could trust year after year. These changes were more than cosmetic. Each handle experiment was a quiet answer to a simple question. How do you make a tool that lasts forever, but also feels right in the hand? The solutions, first leather, then vinyl, showed a willingness to adapt without ever letting go of the core promise. Comfort mattered, but not at the cost of permanence. The next step would demand more than material swaps. It would call for a scientific fix to the one flaw steel could not hide, the shock that traveled straight from hammer to bone. In the 1990s, Estwing's engineers faced a challenge that no amount of steel could solve on its own. Every swing of a one-piece hammer sent a jolt up the arm, a reminder that durability sometimes comes at the cost of comfort. Inside the Rockford plant, the solution took shape not through marketing, but through testing and measurement. The answer arrived as the shock reduction grip, a polymer handle molded directly onto the steel. Its signature hump wasn't just for looks, it was engineered to flex and absorb the sting of each blow. Internal reports showed a 15% drop in peak vibration reaching the user's hand, a number that meant fewer numb fingers and less fatigue at the end of a long shift. The SRG wasn't a gimmick or a shortcut. It was the result of years spent studying what made the hammer both loved and feared. Estwing's team didn't soften the core promise. They wrapped it in science, using a proprietary blend of polymers that bonded to metal without slipping or peeling, even after years on muddy job sites. For the first time, a tool that prided itself on being unbreakable could also claim to be easier on the body. The blue-collar ritual, grabbing a hammer at dawn, swinging until dusk, became just a little less punishing. And the distinctive shape of the SRG handle became another mark of loyalty, a quiet signal that this was a tool designed for real work, by people who understood what real work felt like. A hammer isn't just a tool, it's a mark of belonging. For tradespeople, the Estwing isn't picked off the shelf on a whim. It is often handed down, its handle worn smooth by another set of hands. In union halls and family garages, stories pile up alongside the tools themselves. A Chicago carpenter remembers his father's Estwing, still resting on a nail above the workbench, the leather grip darkened by decades of sweat. Across the country, a mason in his 60s points to a blue-handled hammer and says, "That one's outlasted 3 trucks and 2 marriages." The loyalty runs deep, and it isn't just nostalgia. When asked what matters most in choosing a hammer, trade surveys echo a single word: durability. One recent poll of United States tradespeople found that nearly 4 out of 5 said they would rather pay more for a hammer that lasts than buy a cheap one twice. That same stubbornness runs through Estwing's warranty. It offers lifetime coverage, no fine print, as if the company is betting you will never need it. For many, that promise isn't just about saving money. It's about trust, about knowing the tool in your hand is the same one your mentor once swung, and that it will still be there for the next apprentice who earns it. In 1994, Estwing's boardroom filled with the weight of a decision that would define the company's next century. The numbers on the table were stark. Offshoring core forging could shave 12% off production costs, a tempting figure as cheaper imports flooded the market. On the other side of the ledger sat something harder to quantify: 150 jobs in Rockford, a century of factory know-how, and the promise stamped on every hammer that left the line. The debate, preserved in board minutes, ran late into the night. Some argued for flexibility, others for tradition. She points to the 1994 memo where the final vote is recorded. Estwing would keep all hammer and axe forging in Rockford. The cost savings were real, but the risk to the brand was greater. For the workers on the floor, the outcome meant another generation could clock in, knowing their labor still shaped every tool. For the company, the decision became a badge. American made, not as a slogan, but as a lived reality. That stubborn refusal to chase the lowest bidder is why the Blue Grip and the Estwing name still mean something on a crowded tool rack. The hammer's promise, head and handle as one, remained unbroken, not just in steel, but in the place that made it. Estwing's reputation did not stop at the job site. Over the decades, the company's single-piece philosophy spread into a family of tools, axes, bricklayers' hammers, roofers' picks, and the legendary geology pick that once traveled to the moon's doorstep. In the 1960s, as NASA prepared astronauts for the Apollo missions, Neil Armstrong practiced with an Estwing geology pick during lunar training. That same pick, forged in Rockford, became a quiet part of America's race to space. By 2005, the Smithsonian Institution placed an Estwing hammer in its National Museum of American History, recognizing it not as a relic, but as a living artifact of American industry. The company's centennial in 2023 brought new attention to this legacy. Limited edition hammers rolled off the line, stamped with the original logo, and collectors lined up for a piece of history. Each new product, each museum honor, each anniversary only deepens the sense that this hammer and the company behind it stands for something permanent in a world built on replacement. Today, nearly 8 out of 10 tradespeople still say that durability decides what they buy. That is why, in a world obsessed with upgrades, a one-piece hammer from Rockford still feels permanent. Estwing's refusal to change is its defiance, proof that some tools are not meant to be replaced. In a disposable age, lasting things remind us what is worth holding on to. 5 brands, 5 different factories, 5 different decisions. Tim Leatherman sat at a kitchen table for 7 years with a tool no one wanted to sell. Then, 128 million people proved them wrong. The De-Arment family looked at what happened to Vise-Grip, a brand gutted and moved overseas in a single boardroom afternoon, and decided that would never be the story of Channellock. It has not been, not yet. Buck Knives packed 100 years of American manufacturing into 50 tractor trailers and drove north into Idaho, rather than take the easier road to Asia. 190 people stayed behind. The knives kept going. Tony Maglite built the most trusted flashlight in America from a one-man garage in Los Angeles. He refused to move his factory to China. He refused to abandon his workers. He lost the empire. The factory is still standing. He still walks the floor. And Estwing has been forging the same hammer in the same building in Rockford, Illinois, since 1923. No acquisition, no outsourcing, no compromise. Over 100 years of holding exactly the line they drew at the beginning. 5 decisions. 5 different answers to the same question that every American company eventually faces. What are you willing to give up to survive? And what are you willing to lose rather than give up? The tools are still out there, in garages, in toolboxes, in the back of trucks driven by people who know the difference between something built to last and something built to be replaced. They are still there because someone, somewhere, made a decision that could not be measured on a spreadsheet. That is the story this channel exists to tell. There are more of them. Every week, another one. We will see you then.